Permit me to take you on a journey back in time, to a time where people were fed their own flesh, where men were treated like dogs, killed at will, and their offspring sold like some cheap piece of item. It was a long and hectic day. The last thing Ugo saw was the long whip on the soldier's hand, with which he used to draw blood from an old woman's back. The sight was so horrible that Ugo had to pass out and was carried away by her father. The woman was stripped in front of the whole village, and two soldiers took turns to draw water and flesh from her back at the command of the king. It was said that the old woman was the palace nanny, and she was caught stealing food from the palace kitchen. The question on everyone's mind was, if she were to be a freeborn, as they call those who are not slaves, would she have been treated like that? The last Eke market day, a man was hanged in the village square because he fought with another man who must have troubled him first. He was hanged without any petition and fair hearing just because he is a slave. This is the world Ugo finds herself in, a discriminated world. They said her ancestors were slaves, so she inherited slavery from them. When Ugo regained consciousness, she ran from where her parents were and let out a loud cry. She screamed at the soldiers, and for a moment everywhere became still. She pointed at the king and her queen and said to them, "The evil you've brought upon this poor woman shall visit you and your household. You will smell pain, and with your tongue will tell how it tastes. Did you feed this woman well, and she stole from you?" The impetuousness of Ugo's voice made everyone look at her with their mouth wide open, like she had cast a spell on them. The king stood from his throne and walked to where Ugo was and gave her a sound slap. He yelled at his soldiers, "You stand here and watch this shithole point her dirty finger at me?" Everyone was confused. Even the king doesn't know whom to direct his anger to, whether to direct it to Ugo, who stood fearlessly before him, or to the entire enslaved clan, or to his soldiers. Ugo's father had already gotten himself wet with his own urine. He feared so much for himself and his daughter, in fact for his entire household. He knew that it would take the king nothing to command that his entire family be wiped out because of the sins of Ugo. Ugo, however, was ready to take whatever punishment they might serve her for standing up to the king. She always says to herself that the dead are better than a living slave in her community. The king commanded that Ugo be beaten on her bare back and given 100 whips for disrespecting the king. Just then, her father ran, knelt before the king, and offered himself to be punished and that Ugo should be spared. Ugo watched her father being beaten like a donkey. She stood dead to a spot and let out a loud cry. What happened next was what only the gods could describe, an event that brought an end to slavery in their community. In a certain community in far African land, the land thrived and flourished in their business, including farming and the merchandise of slavery. Rich men were measured by the size of their barn and the number of slaves in their household. People bought other people in the market, just like you buy goods and livestock. There was a slave market, and these slaves are used for so many different things, such as working on the farms of their owners without pay and little food, doing domestic chores for their owners, and carrying people and goods like beasts of burden. This has existed in the community for many generations, yet the segregation and discrimination didn't diminish, it only got worse. It was said that slaves were punished for the slightest provocations. A little boy was beaten till he died for staring at a titled chief for long. They said he was looking at him with hate in his eyes. Ordinary stare. To them, it's not ordinary. Anything a slave does is a threat to them. They denied the slaves the right to own properties. It was said that they are properties and as such shouldn't own a property. When a prominent man dies, healthy and well-built slaves are buried alongside with him alive to continue serving him in the land of the dead. The horrible treatment slaves get in that community continued for many years until the day Ugo challenged the king. It was said that Ugo named herself. Her parents named her Ifeoma when she was born, but when she learned to talk, she named herself Ugo. Whenever she's asked her name, she says, "My name is Ugo," and people began to call her that. Ugo, which translates to an eagle, is what she calls herself. She learned sword fighting and combat all by herself. She practices this art of fighting in the middle of the night when no one will see her, for it is a taboo for a slave to learn to fight. That day, as they raised the whip to give Ugo's father another stroke, she took out the knife she had been hiding in her skirt and with the speed of light stabbed all the soldiers standing in the village square. Everything happened like a flash. The king sank in total shock. Nobody knew what had happened. They just saw that all the soldiers are lying dead, and the ones that still had life in them were groaning in pain. She stood with the blood-stained knife staring deep into the eyes of the king. She stood for some time, looking at the shivering king. She helped her father up and took him home. It was quite a sight in the village that day. Everyone was in shock. They were all afraid except the slaves. At least, it seems like their salvation is near. Young men and young women paid homage to Ugo. They asked her how they could help her in fighting those trampling on them. Ugo told them that she wants to raise an army. She stood on a rock in a forest and blew a horn. All the young men and young women of the slave descent assembled before her. She addressed them and began to train them. But before the training, she performs a ritual on them. After the ritual, she would either reject the candidate or accept them. They began to prepare for war. They chant war songs, and for once in their lives, they forgot about the chains the community had put on their legs and on their hands and began to fortify themselves to fight for themselves. Ugo sent a message to the king that she and her people have a message for the entire community. The people were assembled, and Ugo led her soldiers to the village square. She stood on a podium and began to address the people. She said, "Never again shall any human in this community be treated like a piece of item that doesn't matter. No more shall people from my tribe be treated like dogs that you can kill at your will and even sell off their children. Henceforth, all beings in this community are equal and should be treated as such. If not, this land will be washed with blood and water from the veins of all of us." The village was still quiet. No one dared oppose her or murmur against what she had just said. This didn't go well with the people of the community, the freeborn as they call them, because their ancestors had taught them never to associate with the people called slaves. The king had a secret meeting with his soldiers to ambush Ugo and all her soldiers and to kill them all. Ugo and her soldiers, however, are always 10 steps ahead. They would have been fools to expect the king and the community to accept them so easily as one of them. They planned an ambush, but Ugo and her soldiers are not relaxing either. They had planted traps in the paths that lead to their camp and around their camp. Only she and her soldiers know where all these traps were buried. They prepared their archers and they hid at the hills. Ugo's level of diplomacy surprised her people. On the night the king's soldiers ambushed them, Their cries alerted Ugo and her soldiers, as most of them fell into the traps and couldn't move. Ugo signaled her archers, and from the hill they shot at every single soldier that came to their camp that night. The next day, they sent word to the king that he should come and carry his lifeless soldiers. The king knew that he was in big trouble. Ugo and her soldiers decided to pay a king a visit the next morning. As they reached the king's palace that morning, the king was shaken to his marrows. He reached out for his gun and without a second thought, shot at Ugo. Her soldiers ran towards the king and beat life out of him. They killed the king to atone the blood of Ugo. As Ugo died gradually, she kept smiling and said, "At least, our sons will have liberty and freedom in the land of their birth. May our freedom last forever." As Ugo shut her eyes in death, her soldiers cried. They had lost an icon. The freedom Ugo fought for, however, lived on with her people. A statue of her was made, and she was remembered forever. I hope you find this story interesting. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what you think about the story. Please help us grow. Subscribe. Thank you.